This is tape number 2 of the Jack L. Davies Ag Fund Oral History Series, and this is an interview on October 17th, 2008, with Don McFarland, and I am the interviewer, Ruth Ziegler. So, Don, you were telling us about the Economic Development Corporation. Was this, you were working on it, and is this a Napa County?
Yes, it was a new thing, and I don't know why, but I was asked to head it up, and Al Haberger, who was the
county administrator,
felt very strongly about a role a thing like this should play in land development. In other words, that if you had a lot of money and you wanted to build a factory, you didn't have any more weight than somebody else who was better suited to the environment you wanted. And so we did that. We formed this organization, and we had representatives from each of the cities. And we started talking right away about, let's be sure that part of our responsibility is not just to build an economy, it's to make sure it's well suited to what we want in this county and to the environmental considerations.
Well, that was extremely forward.
It was different from most economic development organizations, yeah.
Was some of the influence from what came about in the 1960s, Rachel Carson, and people who were concerned about the environment?
Well, I think so. Just naturally, people who were involved in the vineyards and that sort of thing then were naturally
would be concerned.
Sure.
And so what was your mandate then with the Economic Development Corporation?
Well, it was to develop the organization first, make sure it had a board that was very representative of the county in all respects, including land use, and then start working, get a general plan, economic development plan together, and then start to administer it. And I just got started in that and did a few things, including bringing a couple of businesses in that were appropriate for the area. And then my friends and I decided we were going to build this company, and I had to leave.
I see.
That's when I...
Now, were you at this time serving on the Planning Commission?
Yes.
As well as trying to put together the Economic Development Corporation?
So there was some cross-fertilization there.
So when you set up your own company, you continued still to be a member of the Planning Commission?
No, because the agreement was that I had to be out building the company. That took me out of the area completely.
Oh, right, you were saying that.
Yeah.
Well, now, while you were on the Planning Commission, when was the first time that you can remember that there was a discussion of creating an ag preserve?
Oh boy, I don't know if I could say that. I don't know. But each time we had a general hearing on the proposals that we had, it got more. We spent more time on it than I thought we were going to spend, but I'm glad we did.
And where did the proposals come from? Were these people who came to address the Planning Commission?
Individuals.
Individuals like Jack Davies,
yeah.
Or just members of the public?
From the public, a couple of vintners, maybe.
And was the Planning Commission initially fairly well disposed to considering an ag preserve?
It took some time, but Felix Vandershoot was a very good chairman, very good. And Al Haberger watched us from the side, and he was absolutely committed to the ag preserve idea, Didn't say so, but we found out he was, and we were forever grateful that he did what he did.
Now, so what was the role of the Planning Commission with, in terms of the idea of creating an ag preserve? Was the role to vote on an ag preserve and then forward that on to the Board of Supervisors? Is
Right.
that how it worked? And I understand at first the Planning Commission had been considering a 40-acre minimum lot size. But then the Planning Commission backed off of that and recommended a 20-acre lot size.
We felt the thing would sell better in the beginning at 20 with the idea that if it really is as good as we think it is, there's going to be a demand for it to be increased. And sure enough, that's what happened.
I see. That was clever.
Well, it was
so you
practical.
you start with something that's going to be more acceptable to the public,
Yeah.
knowing that if it's popular, then people will want to expand that.
Even then, the night we approved it was up here at the Yountville Community Hall. We approved it, and we had a lot of boos. They weren't the majority of people, but there were a lot of boos. In fact, when I started to leave, walking out the back door, and these two fellows, they looked like they were vendors, walked up to me and said, "How dare you do that to spoil and ruin our value of our property?" And I said, "I don't know. I think eventually you're going to find out that that's wrong." And I know now that it was wrong. But one of them took me by the lapels of my coat and started shaking me.
Really?
How dare you do that?
Well, it was a pretty brave position for you to take in the midst of a lot of objections.
Yeah, but it became clarion clear. That was a very, very good answer, and it's proved.
So the Planning Commission voted on this 2-acre minimum lot size. 20 acre,
20 acres,
sorry.
uh-huh.
20 acre. And then that was forwarded to the Board of Supervisors who approved it.
Right. Uh-huh.
And then I read about a number of public hearings that were held, but it's a little confusing from the record that I read. Who held public hearings?
There's a process things like this follow where at the Planning Commission level you have to have public hearings, but then before it can be approved by the board, they have to have public hearings again.
I see. So you each have public hearings.
You
The
bet.
first stage is the public hearings held by the Planning Commission.
It's the planning elements, yeah.
And did you hold public meetings in various communities
We
in
did.
Napa County?
We did.
And was there a lot of opposition at all these public hearings?
No, as I remember, I've thought about this many times, and I think a lot of not having a lot of opposition was that an awful lot of people didn't really know yet what it all stood for. That's why we took more time with having more public hearings than ordinarily we would. But and I never sensed a tremendous opposition to it, frankly, and maybe that I was just wishful thinking or something. But there were people both in the so-called ag preserve and outside of it who didn't like it because they didn't want to be told what to do with their property.
Yes, well, that is a common reaction.
Sure.
The Planning Commission public hearings that were held in various communities, would all the Planning Commission members attend each of those hearings?
Yes.
And how would you decide how many hearings were enough? Did you just have one in each community?
Yeah, it usually had to do with the districts in the county, the 5 districts, and but in a couple of cases we joined the 2 districts together because they were small. I think we probably had 3 major public hearings
Altogether.
altogether.
And then how did you publicize the meetings?
Newspaper, whatever, anything we could. If we got on local radio, we'd do it. Just making sure that any medium we had to get it to the public, we got it.
Were they well attended?
Yeah, they were. Not as much as I thought they would be, though. And it's true with a lot of things like this, where after the decision's made, you find out there are a lot more people out there who wish they'd come to the earlier meetings. And we wish that as well,
Because this was the first wave, so
It was the first
this
wave.
is just the very first introduction.
Right.
Now, the Planning Commission then made this recommendation to the Board of Supervisors for the 20-acre minimum lot size. Then the board itself conducted public hearings.
Right.
And were those were also community-based, those hearings?
Well, generally speaking, the supervisors would hold their meetings in the supervisors' offices.
Chambers. And people would come there. And then did you go to those hearings yourself as a...
I always did, and most of our planning commissioners did.
And were those well attended?
Pretty well, but still not as much as I thought they ought to be.
How many people would you say would attend a typical hearing?
Oh, depends on, for example, the planning commission meetings were in large halls, and we would have somewhere between 100 and 200 people, where the supervisors would have probably between 25 and 50. But that usually had people who were really at the stage where, they hadn't been satisfied yet.
Oh, yes. So they wanted to expand on whatever had been discussed at the Planning Commission level. I wanted to ask you, so I wanted to ask you, at what point were you the most proud of what the Planning Commission was doing?
I think it had to be the night we voted finally to approve it up here at the Yountville Community Center. And it was like somebody had taken I think everyone on the commission felt the same, like somebody had taken a tremendous load off our backs, because whether people liked it or not, we were trying our darndest to get full understanding and full participation, and we had a big turnout that final night.
What was your biggest disappointment in the Ag Preserve issue with the Planning Commission?
I think it was because there were quite a few people who who were going to be affected by it, who should have understood it better, and that's my way of saying it, and who in effect were against it. And they were very vocal when we passed it. They did the same thing with the Board of Supervisors. And I don't think it's appropriate for me to say it now, but it would be real interesting for every one of those people who was against it. You could track them and see how they came out of it all right.
So I wanted to ask you, what was one of the most humorous events that you witnessed, or was it not humorous at all?
Well, in an odd way, maybe. I mean, this one when we voted, and then I was trying to leave the hall, and these fellows came up to me and grabbed me by the front of my coat and shook me and said, "How terrible! How could I do that to them?" And I look back and think, well, that's so silly, because I think in most of those cases, those guys were, their property was, they couldn't control it all. That's what they wanted. But what the control was this ag preserve that protected them, and they eventually found out it did.
But it's reasonable that some people would wonder.
You bet.
Where the value was going to go.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah.
Now, the Board of Supervisors then approved the creation of ag preserve lands in April of 1968, I believe.
I guess so. I've forgotten, frankly.
And then you were still on the Planning Commission when the board approved. What was your role on the Planning Commission after the approval?
It was to hear complaints on primarily technical things, to see if we could make sure that there was no misunderstanding, and that's primarily most of it. When we'd meet and somebody would come and say, "I don't understand what this will do if you do this,"
Yes, well, there would be a lot of questions, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And in that case, it was Mervyn Learnhardt's role to advise you?
Yep.
And there was a lawsuit, of course, filed.
Yeah.
Were you still on the Planning Commission when
No.
the suit was filed?
I was gone.
You were gone. And the next role was to actually reflect the Ag Preserve ordinance in the general plan. Is that right? Napa County General
Right.
Plan? Were you still on the Planning Commission at that point?
Yes, I was.
So what was the year that you left?
I left in 1976.
76. And in 1977, the Board of Supervisors, I think, passed an ordinance that expanded the lands that would be
Right.
covered by an ag preserve. So that would have been just after you
It
left.
was.
But was that one of the issues
It
that
was.
you did deal
It made
with?
me feel very happy looking at it from the long distance, to know that's what happened.
That they wanted to make it even more
Right.
effective. Then when you left the Planning Commission in 1976, were you involved at all in land use issues after that?
I was, but in other states. It had to do with the facilities that we would have to have in the various cities that we developed in. And so it did help me working with the local authorities, and they were usually very pleased that I had the background I had, because we didn't waste a lot of time arguing about things like that.
Well, yes, you'd been through it.
Yeah.
While you were on the Planning Commission, how much did Planning Commission members talk among themselves outside of the meetings? Would you all?
No, very careful about that. And once in a while after a meeting, somebody would say, "What did you think about that?" And my goodness sake, that is crazy. But no,
You didn't.
I don't. I certainly didn't, and the fellows I knew didn't do it.
Were you were not supposed to?
They're not supposed to, because it generally would be expected that there'd be some decision made outside of the.
Oh, outside of the meeting.
Yeah.
So everything had to be, all the discussions were restricted to the actual meetings,
Supposed to be, yeah.
so that there were no sort of back room
Right.
decisions
right.
being made.
Yeah.
Which totally makes sense. And the Planning Commission members, your co-members, you got along with, and they
Oh yeah.
pretty much got along, even if they had differences of opinion?
You bet. Good guys.
There are a number of people who look to how this ag preserve was created in Napa County, and then compare it with Sonoma. Why wasn't there an ag preserve created in Sonoma County?
I've never understood that. I've never have. And as a matter of fact, this is a limited consideration, but the Ag Preserve in Napa County has been a very, very firm supporter of the wineries that have been built and succeeded here. And Sonoma County is trying to emulate Napa County with the wineries, So I don't know how they did that.
But they're not nearly as successful
No, they're not.
at land preservation.
Right.
Well, some people suggest that the city of Santa Rosa has a lot to do with it, because it's sort of the economic engine,
is.
perhaps, of Sonoma County. But we have the city of Napa, and it's obviously smaller than Santa Rosa, but nevertheless.
Santa Rosa, though, is on a direct line with people who moved even on a day-to-day basis to the Bay Area, San Francisco and what have you. Very heavy movement there. It was that way even way back.
Oh, it was?
Yeah.
It was sort of on a commuter line. And Napa wasn't.
No.
So now I just wanted to ask you, Don, about some of the challenges that Napa County faces today. A lot of people talk about, of course, tourism as a big challenge to creating or maintaining the ag preserve, but also the pressure for both affordable housing and increased housing. How do you see that?
As you know, there are state directives related to the percentage of housing you have to have available in your community to take care of employees. And it's almost been a problem. Well, it has been a problem in Napa where in order to satisfy those requirements have nothing at all to do with the good or bad of the county. It's a regional and state situation. So in order to satisfy the requirements, there's always an argument about where we're going to put those buildings. And as you probably know, what's been going on a little bit in the past is that various towns and cities in the county have traded deals. In other words, they say, if you could take some of these buildings that would be helpful, then we'll work with you on some other land use thing that would be helpful to you.
Just trading, you mean? And these standards are set for the state by ABAG, is that correct? ABAG?
Yeah, American Bay Area Governments. That some parts of it are, yeah. But the overall administration of the distribution and of people in a community are based on the state
mandate. And so they will determine each year how much housing needs to be satisfied. But of course that works against the grain of the ag preserve.
Well, it's been a real test, and a big, very important thing is for the people who are on that committee, the commission, understand the idea that there are certain circumstances and areas where you shouldn't have a lot of housing, and there are others where you can have an awful lot of it because it doesn't violate anything in terms of land use codes or natural habitat or anything, you know. That's the big deal. It becomes a political thing, in effect.
Yes, well, it seems unwise to have a sort of formula that gets applied, whether, despite the differences from one county to another. And certainly Napa County has a huge difference from...
Yeah, and other counties don't, I'm sure, wish they could do the same thing, or they don't like what we have, the right we have. So it's a continual challenge on the part of the leaders in Napa County to make sure we don't just blow the whole thing by start bringing in a lot of housing for people. And you'll probably realize, you know, this one of the developments down at the old pipe mill down below Napa, they want to put quite a few in relatively inexpensive places in for workers in the county.
This is the Napa Pipe Project?
Right.
And this is